And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Okay, tonight's weather again, we've got a weakening low here, drifting slowly northeast toward False Pass, starting to lift into the Bering Sea, and a stronger front here pushing some gale force winds, and again, possibly storm force gusts out there into the western Aleutians and Bering Sea. Otherwise, stays unsettled with periods of rain and snow, especially along the North Gulf Coast into western Prince William Sound. Rain becoming more showery over the southern southeast coast, ending central and southern areas there. And then for tomorrow, this warm front spreads some rain up to the northern panhandle back along the North Gulf Coast. A little bit drier here for Cook Inlet, Madawaska-Susitna Valley. Stays dry in the interior, scattered showers southwest coast, all the way down to the Alaska Peninsula. And this front pushing into the central Aleutians with some gale force wind and rain, already starting to weaken. And we'll see on Sunday that low center staying back to the west there, but good westerly flow. As you can see, strong westerly flow across the Bering Sea here pushes that front right into the southwest coast, but weakening as it moves along. And the Bristol Bay, rain pushing into Kodiak Island, dry over the interior. This low comes northward to Prince William Sound, not very strong, but we'll bring some more rain into that area, eastern Kenai Peninsula, turning an arm on along the North Gulf Coast into the northern Panhandle. Coastal water forecast, southeast 15 to 20 knots for the Panhandle along the coast for Saturday. Seas at about 10 feet, and then east-southeast 20 to 25 knots on the central coast, and east winds 25 to 30 knots for the north coast. Inside waters, southeast winds 10 knots, seas 2 to 6 feet, highest for Clarence Strait. And then those light winds will be replaced with small craft advisories for Sunday, all out of the southeast, all at 25 knots with higher gusts. And southeast winds here for the central and south coast at 30 knots, and the north coast, east-southeast, 30 to 35 knots. Prince William Sound, Saturday, southeast at 20 knots. East-southeast winds for the eastern North Gulf Coast, 30 to 35 knots with 10-foot seas. Northeast 20 knots here south of Resurrection Bay. Southeast 20 knots, Barren Islands on up into the Kamishak Bay area and Cook Inlet. Looking at northeast winds, 10 to 15 knots with 2 to 4-foot seas. And for Sunday, Cook Inlet, north winds 10 to 20 knots. Northeast at 20 for Kamishak Bay. Light variable winds for the Barren Islands at 10 knots with seas around 4 feet. And north winds at 20 knots for the western North Gulf Coast. Prince William Sound, northeast winds at 20 knots, seas 4 feet. East-northeasterlies at 30 knots for the eastern North Gulf Coast with 8-foot seas. Kodiak Island, southeast winds 15 to 20 knots for Saturday. Bristol Bay, small craft advisories for a southeast wind at 25 knots. And the Alaska Peninsula, south to southeast winds 15 to 20 knots with seas running 3 to 9 feet. And then for Sunday, we've got gale warnings here for the Alaska Peninsula for south to southwest winds at 30 to 35 knots. Southeast winds 25 knots. Continue for Bristol Bay. Kodiak Island, east to southwest winds at 15 knots. Eastern Aleutians for Saturday, west winds 20 to 30 knots. Gale warnings for the central Aleutians, Adak and Atka, south winds 40 knots, 8 to 13-foot seas. And south to southwest winds 45 knots from Amchitka to Shemya with seas as high as 19 feet. And then for Sunday, still have gale warnings out here west of Adak, south to south or west southwesterlies at 35 knots Amchitka Island, west at 40 knots Kiska to Shemya. And for Adak and Atka, southwest 30-knot winds there, and about the same for the eastern Aleutians, a little more westerly at about 30 knots. And for the southwest coast, for Saturday, east winds 15 to 20 knots. Same thing for St. Lawrence Island and Norton Sound, easterlies 15 to 20 knots. Variable winds at 15 for the Pribilof Islands, but east winds 45 knots there for St. Matthew Island with seas at 9 feet. And then for Sunday, gale force west-southwest winds here for the Bering Sea, Pribilof, St. Matthew Island out of the west-southwest at 35 knots. Southeast 30-knot winds for the Kuskokwim Delta coast. East 25-knot winds here for the Yukon Delta coast, St. Lawrence Island, and Norton Sound. Eastern Boulevard Sea coast tomorrow, west-northwest winds 10 to 15 knots. Really laid down here on the central coast, east at 5 and back up to 15 knots for the western Arctic coast. Chukchi Sea, east winds at 20 knots with 4-foot seas. And for Sunday, east winds 20 knots for the 20 to 25 knots here for the Chukchi Sea. So really not much change, seas 4 to 5 feet. East winds at 20 knots for the western Arctic coast. And the central and eastern Beaufort Sea coast looking at east winds at 15 knots.